Hello everyone and welcome to this video where I want to talk about an idea I have for a major update here to Stormworks. As always, my little disclaimer is I don't necessarily say this is the best idea, I don't necessarily say they have to do this, I'm just suggesting, presenting an idea, content creating discussion, seeing the interest, and if the developers go ahead and make this, awesome. If they don't, all is good. I'm gonna make these videos because I enjoy making these videos. Yes, there are bugs they have to fix. No, this video will not talk about that. So, with that said, what I want to talk about is inflatables. Now, we have a vast assortment of vehicles that we could build in the game. We currently only have the so-called block piece that you see here, and doesn't really define the type of material. Obviously, different inventory have different densities, such as the floats. They are 1 mass for this whole item, so they have a very low density. And then you have other things like the barrel for the gun, I forget which one it is, that has a large density for a very small object, because this is 3x1 and it weighs 40 mass, whereas even our weight block has 10 mass, so you'd have to have 4 of them to weigh the same amount as this. So while we only have one material, let's call it, we have various masses and densities for those objects, which leads me to the discussion of inflatables. The game currently does not operate in that type of manner. Everything is this pre-made block. But if you've noticed, on all of my ships, I tend to have these floats sort of stashed away, and they're supposed to represent inflatable life rafts. Of course, with it being 1 mass, it does not work properly with the physics of the game. Of course, it has to have some weight on it in order for it to properly spawn and work with the water. But that's kind of how the floats, the system and the weighting works in the game. So you get things like that, but that's okay for the basis of the game and not the basis of the discussion, because this isn't an inflatable part. Now, what would be something similar would be this awesome mod, this add-on that you get here in the workshop, the inflatable life rafts. It is developed by user Teniente Velaskovich and Yuli Build, and as you can see here, the game will add inflatable life rafts through the system, and we're going to check out and see how they work. You can see it even adds evacuation slides, as well as simple type of life rafts and modern style of life rafts. Now, I do have the add-on loaded into my game, so I just have to spawn this vehicle. And once this is spawned, you can test out how it works. But in essence, there's this block here, and when you press this, it deploys it, and once it falls into the water, it will become this sort of life raft. Now, I'm not sure, that's not balanced properly, it's not working as it should, but if I spawn a secondary one, you see this one here is working properly, and it even has kind of the little interior that you can get into. It has pumps and everything, so you can see or get an idea for what this add-on is supposed to do in terms of creating these life rafts. Of course, I'm not sure why this one sunk, maybe it needs an update, but the point is, this type of development now relies purely on both programming, coding, and an add-on in order to work. Inside the add-on developer, you can get a good feeling for the different types of life rafts that are included. So if you go to this one here, you can see this one has a lot of seating inside. Some of these are different. They all have some kind of life equipment, lights, and then here you have these slides for the aircrafts. So you get a variety of different things that you can do. Now, this idea is fantastic, and I truly love the creativity by these two developers who made this. And then I asked my Discord server what sort of things can we add to the base game. As I like to do, I like to make videos of ideas and things. So that's where they suggested Inflatable. inflatables. Not just life rafts, but just inflatables in general. So I did some thinking, I did some consulting with my Discord members, asked them questions, what they'd like to see, and I've come up with a couple of suggestions that I think could be added into the base game by the developers and give us that additional ability in the game to build and play with inflatables, especially with the compressed gases update. I think these kind of go hand in hand. So the first one that I want to discuss would be a pre-made inflatable, and it'll use a system similar to the existing vehicle parachute, and it'll look something along these lines. And again, just like the parachute, it'll have a deploy button, and when you press that button, so you attach it to electricity, just like the, well, this one's not attached to electricity. This would be if you do a instrument panel, it wouldn't be, but the point is you press this and it deploys something like a float, and it could be just called an airbag, for example. And then you can use this airbag, and possibly what I think would be useful for that would be to have the rope anchors spawned on the end. So in essence, it could be literally just this single float with 2 rope anchors like that on the side. And the purpose of this would be when you press this button, this thing appears, and, well, appears somewhere. That's sort of the purpose as well. Like, you would have to have a system where it doesn't appear on your head. It appears somewhere logical. What I imagine is it shoots out of this. So you wouldn't have this facing this way. In this case, it would shoot up into the sky. But let's say you have this on the side of your ship, like that. And then you press this button, and then this float kind of pops out of it and drops into the water. So this would give us one type of pre-made element. Now, maybe there are other pre-made inflatables that you could think of. I think it's too much to say we'd get a pre-made boat or inflatable life raft or something. I don't like that. But we do have things like the harness, for example. That's sort of a pre-made seat. We do have things like the medical bed. So maybe we could have there be a very simple style of, whether it be a life raft or a slide, or maybe it gives us different shapes of this float. Maybe we have a wide one, maybe we have something like this, and then it kind of gives us the ability to have a quick deploying version of that. So even with this system, I believe the developers would have to refine or adjust how small and light creations, vehicles interact with the water. Right now it's not quite optimized for things that are, say, 1 weight block, but nothing says that the developers have to make this 1 weight or 1 mass. They could make this 10 mass or 20 mass, and it kind of just bobs on the surface rather than shoots up from the water like what we saw in the example earlier. So I would say it would be like a neutral buoyancy float, and it would just kind of bob on the surface, not sink, but not drop or not shoot up to the top. So this would be the first one. The second one would be one-time use objects, and with one-time use objects, it would be things like emergency rafts and stuff. But how do you develop them? How do you build them? They're not pre-made like what we have here. You actually have to make it yourself. Now, the one-time use objects, I'm just going to put a placeholder for now. The one-time use inflatables would be fast to inflate. They would be loud. They would make a popping sound or like a whoosh. And they would be things like emergency aircraft slides, emergency life rafts, that type of thing. They could only be used once. They're very fast, and after that, they just have to be despawned. They're no longer useful and able to be stowed away. Then we come to the multi-use items, and for multi-use, these ones would be things like actual rib boats where you can inflate and deflate the hull if you want. You'd be able to have fenders on boats. You'd be able to have lift bags, so you could make your own lift bag and then drop it down. Or you can have things like recreational slides, recreational boats, other things that are not necessarily fast to deploy, like our emergency ones or one-time use ones, but things that can be inflated and deflated. Then you can open up doors into things like hovercrafts, hot air balloons, blimps, all that type of stuff. So for this, we're going to call this option number 3. So we have our pre-mades, we have our one-time use, and we have our multi-use. Now, again, the pre-made one makes a lot of sense. It pops out of this shape and becomes this. What do we do for these ones? Now, these two, whether it be multi-use or whether it be one-time use, they'd have to have their own type of development area. And what I want to bring your attention to is our existing microcontroller editor. So the microcontroller editor is a perfect comparison that can lead us to how these inflatables could work. So how I can see this working is there'd be another button here along the top that would be for your inflatables. And when you'd click on it, it would open up a menu just like this. It would be your inflatable menu, your inflatable schematic, and you can adjust the size of that starting point. So what I'm going to do is show you an example here. We have our empty microcontroller and we put it here. So you'd go into this, except it wouldn't be a microcontroller, this would be an inflatable. Maybe instead of being square and looking kind of like this, it would rather be more round, let's say, and not necessarily look the same. It also wouldn't be able to contain fluids, so you couldn't use them to make your hull out of this. They would have to be standalone blocks and probably not allow anything around it either. So they'd have to be kind of made in a way maybe a little oversized in a circular way, but regardless, you'd open it up and this would now say, instead of microcontroller or whatever, this would be your inflatable menu, and it would say the name, obviously. So if you go into it here, you could say life raft, for example, and whatever. It could be literally the same with descriptions and everything, and you would have this width and length. Now, what does your width and length do? Because there is no logic in here, it has to be a minimum of 1, because that one node is where your toggle or your push would be, so your multi-use or your one-time use. But this setting and these things will change not the logic, but it will change the size of your workbench. So let me explain this in a very clear way, hopefully. If you set this to 1 by 1, and then here where you press logic, it wouldn't take you to logic, it'll take you to a fresh build menu just like this. But if it's a 1 by 1 block, let's say then you only have a very small area to build something in. So in the case of a 1 by 1 block, you'll have a 5 by 5 cube to build something in. And then as you increase it, it increases in size. So you can end up with, let's say, something that's the size of a small boat if you have the maximum size of that microcontroller type of interface. So it really goes up in size based on the size of your microcontroller, and it just increases your build area. These are the axes, by the way. I'm just showing you your kind of area to construct things in. And then you'd go into your inflatables menu here, and if you increase this and go back to this, then this area that you can build in will increase. Now, in the inflatables menu, of course, you can't inflate an engine, you can't inflate certain things. So inside your menu here, you said life raft, and then you press this button, and this button again takes you to this, and now you build. So you end up with an interface like this with your cube in the center. And again, you have a very small little workbench. These white areas here is what would be actually these black kind of dotted lines. So that would be your build area. And then you'd have this block. And you'd be able to build something out of an inflatable substance. So it would be like an air inflated thing. So even something like this should be able to work, because it's no longer using, it doesn't have to have, let's say, a closed or sealed surface. The block itself is the inflatable. So you don't have to do this to show that it's inflated with air. This in itself already would be inflated with air. So these items would be neutrally buoyant, and then you can build, you know, make it into a life raft, for example, like this. And sure, in the game, the water would spill into this, like it would not obviously block water from being here, but it would just be a neutrally buoyant item. Now, in your inventory, you would not have all of these pieces. You can't build an inflatable propeller, you can't build an inflatable engine, whatever. So it'd be a very, very basic inventory that would say inflatable inventory here. And I think at best, you'd be able to inflate, you'd get blocks like what we have here. So you'd get all the block shapes. You'd get a seat because, I mean, you want to be able to inflate, let's say, a life raft or something. So you'd be able to get a seat. So this would be able to be inflated or inflatable. You can get rope anchors. So you can obviously tow whatever it is you've inflated. So there's certain things like that you'd be able to spawn in here. You would be able to color it, so you get all that. You'd be able to have paintable blocks, so you yourself can make an inflatable with very basic pieces, a very basic kind of inventory, and then able to deploy it. One other thing the inflatable kind of build menu would have is something similar to world view, but rather than world view, it'll be creation view. Now the way that that would work is, say you have this life raft that you want to have spawn on your ship. So first is this microcontroller, or I call it a microcontroller, but inflatable controller, let's call it, that would contain that build. So it would contain that life raft. And you'd be able to put it somewhere like, let's say here. So you'd put this up there, and what you'd end up with is now, when you toggle the single toggle of this inflatable thing, your raft will appear. Now, where will it appear? That is what you decide when you go to that world view button. So just like I explained here, it'd be a world view button, but rather it'd be a creation button or something. And now you'd be able to spawn this. You determine where this goes in relation to your vehicle, but of course you can't put it out here. It has to be in close proximity to this inflatables area. So let's say it would have to be like, you'd be able to set it within a small range, so something like this, let's say, and then you'd paste it, and when you toggle off this worldview, of course, it would just show only this. But this would give you the full basis of where you're putting it in relationship to your actual creation. Now, the idea behind that is, say you do want to build a rigid hull inflatable, you can actually put this microcontroller on the underside of a rigid hull and then design your hull or your inflatable hull around that. So then you can actually put it like this, and then in the builder mode, you're able to place it and say, I want it to grow out like this and that, and kind of cover the bottom of my rib. So there's certain things like that that could work. Also, you'd be able to put your microcontroller on the side of your ship like this, and have it create a ship bumper, for example, or this way you can also make it into a hovercraft. You could use it for other things. Now, inside our what I call our inflatable menu here, there'd be a couple of other toggle switches here. So in addition to choosing the weight, the width and height, which would probably just be in direct relationship with the size area you get to build. So if it's 1 by 1, it would be like 5 by 5 blocks or 3 by 3. And you could increase it out, let's say like this, it would be 3 by 6, so like I'm multiplying, so it'd be like 18. So 18 by 18 would be our maximum, or 3 by 3 would be our smallest, something along those lines. But anyway, as I said, there'd be 2 toggle switches here. One would be to determine whether it is a one-time use or multi-use, so rather than not be a toggle but a switch, so multi-use or one-time use. And beneath it, it would be whether it separates from our microcontroller, our inflatables microcontroller, or whether it stays attached to it. So in the case of this, we'd want it to separate. It would become its own, for lack of a better term, creation that can float away from our main ship. Whereas if we have a ship bumper, or if we have a rigid inflatable hull, it will then remain a part of that creation, or a hovercraft or whatever. It'll remain a part of it, and it'll just expand outwards from this microcontroller and exist in this area. Whereas something like this would actually be able to float away. Now, one thing to keep in mind, other than having the toggle button, let's say, so in this microcontroller, I like the toggle to make it either a one-time use or multi-use, and instead of having a toggle button that communicates to this microcontroller, rather than that, with our new compressed gases update, I think we have something smarter. So, like what I kind of envisioned, of course, you can have this where it just toggles it, and then in this menu you actually set it whether, I guess it would be here, whether you set it to be multi-use, one-time use, attached, or detachable. But why would we use a button if we can actually bring in a pump? Now we have the compressed gases update. Now again, I know they will not for sure model this thing inflating, and I don't expect them to, the developers, but I think what would be quite neat is you have something like this, and depending on what pump you put, or whether it is just a compressed air tank, so you can have something like a small air tank attached to this. So this setup with the small air tank, and of course on your block here, it would be, what I actually imagine, it would be something akin to the cylinders that we have for the modular engine. So it would look more like a cylinder rather than a microcontroller, and it would have kind of these shapes all around it, like that. So now, depending on if you put a compressed gas tank on one of them, or if you put this type of setup on it, will actually determine if it expands rapidly. So this here would be a one-time use. This setup would be for one-time use, whereas this setup would not be for one-time use. This would be for multi-use. And then you actually have a pump, and then you actually have a toggle button or a switch, and you are able to pump up your inflatable with that pump. Now, again, of course, it is a bit of a problematic thing how you'd store it. Now, these one-time use ones are unstorable. Once it's deployed, it's gone. But the one where you can actually bring it back into it would have to kind of have some type of system. Now, maybe that can be done with a hose line. So in addition to having like our cylinder shape, the reason I'm talking cylinder shape is that's how this microcontroller would look. It would look like a cylinder. So what you maybe have to do is grab a hose, attach it to your cylinder microcontroller area. So it'd be like here, there'd be an actual hose kind of node like this. And then your inflatable, let's say the inflatable has to have a hose. And that location of the hose on your inflatable is actually the location of that microcontroller, or the actual location that becomes the point where you can increase it in buoyancy, but also where it communicates. So remember, I said inside this menu, when you go to the microcontroller, the inflatable microcontroller, there is no there's no logic. You don't have this, you don't have this, you have zero logic, but you do have one node of logic that can communicate, and that is this. So wherever you put your hose anchor, and you can only put one per creation, that's where it communicates. And if you connect now this hose from this part on the microcontroller to this part here, but not obviously in the game, but if you yourself walk to these items and connect them together, so if you're out here and you connect this to this, this deflates and becomes a part of this again, and that will in essence be how you can restore it. So you obviously need to be close enough that you can plug it in, And whether you use a pump, whether you use a function, whether you tell it deflate, like obviously you'll have a toggle button to inflate it, but maybe the deflate will actually be something that your character can control right here. Like if I press E while looking at this deflatable anchor, or whatever we want to call it, inflatables anchor, you can actually deflate your object in the world, and in essence that makes it disappear. So if you press this, boom, this thing is gone. So that would kind of get us that, it will help us eliminate random inflatables floating around forever. You can pull that hose. I think the best way would be if it acts like the current key, where you have to actually spin it for 10 seconds. Because of course, if you're sitting inside this thing and you accidentally press this and it deflates, that's no good. But if you have to hold it and it spins around, maybe there's a key, maybe there's a physical thing, it then releases the air and it no longer exists. Or you could use that joint to plug it into here. So those could be two separate things. You could have both a hose and a little like nozzle piece that you could then deflate, but I'm going to leave that up to developers if they decide to pursue this. Of course, these inflatables would not be very susceptible to damage. If you shoot them, they would go away, like they would just disappear. If you smash into something, they'll disappear as well. But of course, like inflatables, they are a bit squishy. They're not hard, they're not rigid, so they should be able to kind of bounce off things. So they should, like in the case of having a bumper here, this shouldn't instantly break. There has to be something to kind of let it hit, and that's kind of the advantage of having the inflatable. But there will be at some point where if you keep hitting it, it will destroy itself, or if it gets hit by something, maybe. Or they could make it fully indestructible by hitting, and that's kind of the advantage of an inflatable, is that it's going to just keep bouncing, keep bouncing, and not get hurt or deflatable. Now again, because the game will not actually model the inflation of this creation, what I almost imagine is just like how we have our parachute, it'll be a very simple style animation where it will be like blowing up, like if you are inflating it slowly like this, rather than it just appearing in this shape, it will like balloon out into the shape of this this object. So if we have here a shape that is 10 by 10, this thing will like slowly grow, like it'll like almost balloon out just like our parachutes, until all of a sudden it will just appear into this. Obviously you're not going to morph the seats and morph the shape, but it'll be like a blob until boom, this thing's here. So that's kind of the one thing where they would have to model in some animation. And the last object that I'd like to point out would be the use of lighter than air gas bags. So you can actually use gas bags for salvage. So in that case, it would probably be a small node. It would just be like the single size one here, and it would be an airbag or gas bag, and it'd be 1 by 1. And in essence, you just create something that looks like that float. And again, it'll have the ability to have the hose anchor or the cable anchors. And when you create something like that, you can actually take it down to a shipwreck. Let's say you have a little piece like this. You can take things like this down to a shipwreck, inflate them, and bring up that shipwreck from the bottom of the ocean. So just like this, it would be quite cool to be able to salvage shipwrecks, salvage things. It could add new missions to the game, to use airbags to kind of bring to the surface something that has been sunk and lost to the sea. Now, whether they be pre-made airbags that you could use, or whether you'd make your own and have the rope anchors and then take it down, somehow deploy it, maybe whether using magulls or connecting to existing anchor locations and pulling it up, that would be really cool. That would be really cool, and I'd love to see that. It would add that extra bit of realism, especially for the salvage type of missions. That would be really cool to have in the game. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope this provided some insight into what the game could look like if the developers were to add inflatables into our current inventory. I do hope that this is at least enlightening in that sense. If there is other things that you'd prefer to see as far as updates, make sure to join my Discord server where we have discussions where I sort of may potentially make a video that will showcase this type of thing to the developers. Regardless, thank you for watching, stay tuned for more, and happy Stormworksing.